Welcome to you all. I'm Alex Jones. I'm director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this very special evening for the Shorenstein Center. Each year, this night is really a highlight for the Shorenstein Center, which in 2014 is marking its 28th birthday. We're being live streamed on the web tonight, and for those of you on Twitter, the event hashtag, as you heard, is White14. And the Shorenstein Center's Twitter handle is @ShorensteinCTR. As some of you already know, the Shorenstein Center was founded in 1986 as a memorial to Joan Shorenstein Barone, a truly remarkable television journalist who died of breast cancer after a distinguished career. Her father, Walter Shorenstein, endowed the center as a place for a focused and searching examination of the intersection of the media, politics, and public policy. Walter was, above all else, a great citizen, and the Theodore White Lecture and the David Nyan Prize are to recognize that same kind of engaged activist citizenship, but from a journalistic perspective. A bit later, you will hear from our Theodore White lecturers for 2014, Mark Halperin and John Heilemann. But first, I have another task to perform, which is also an honor. In 2005, we established the David Nyan Prize for Political Journalism in memory of our friend and former fellow. David Nyan was a man of many parts. He was an Irishman with an instant charisma and a killer smile. As a Shorenstein Fellow, he created a kind of glow. Tonight, we honor another aspect of David Nyan, that of consummate political reporter, which is the role that occupied much of his life and at which he could not be bested. David was a reporter and an editor and then a columnist at the Boston Globe, and his work had both a theme and a character. The theme was almost always power, political power, and also especially the abuse of political power by the big shots at the expense of the little guys. And yet he loved politicians. Well, let me amend that. I think the current political morass would have sent him into a frenzied rage, but that was also part of who he was. But he was always surprising his readers with his take on things, because most of all, David Nyan was his own man, and he called them as he saw them. In his memory and honor, the Nyan family and many friends and admirers of David Nyan have endowed the David Nyan Prize for Political Journalism to recognize the kind of gutsy, stylish, and relentless journalism that David Nyan embodied. David's wife, Olivia, is with us tonight, as are his children, Veronica, Kate, and Nick, his brother Chris, and sister Margot, and I would like to ask all the Nyans to please stand. This year's David Nyan Prize for Political Journalism is awarded to David Rogers, and therein lies a tale, because David Nyan and David Rogers worked together for a time at the Boston Globe. This tale of two Davids comes courtesy of Marty Nolan, another consummate political journalist who was there. This is the way Marty tells it. At the other end of Massachusetts Avenue on the Dorchester-Roxbury line is a bar and grill called the Venetian Garden. It's not really Italian, nor a garden, but for decades it was favored by workers at the electric utility company, the City Morgue, and the Boston Globe. One evening in the late 1970s, Marty and David Nyan were watering at the Venetian Garden. David was the Globe's new city editor, and Marty the Washington bureau chief. And Marty was thinking of recruiting a new correspondent for the Washington bureau. The person he had in mind was David Rogers, who worked for David Nyan covering City Hall. Marty said he was impressed with Rogers, who he found to be diligent, prolific, not afraid of work. No, countered Nyan. He's always pushing the envelope. Half the people in City Hall are mad at him. He just doesn't take no for an answer. And when Marty observed that this sounded exactly like the young David Nyan, Nyan responded in pained anguish, "You don't understand. David Rogers has no respect for authority. Turned out this was typical Nyan mischief. Nyan just didn't want to lose Rogers. And when Marty called Nyan on his effort to try to kill the recruitment, Nyan flashed that killer smile and said, "Worth a try, right?" It's not hard to understand why David Nyan wanted to keep David Rogers. David Rogers is a reporter's reporter, and he has covered Congress for 30 years for the Globe, the Wall Street Journal, and now Politico. And he has done it with a kind of rugged personal integrity that has long been who he is. He was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War, but agreed to be drafted as a medic because, in his words, he couldn't get around the idea that if I didn't go, someone else down the street would have to. He served as a combat medical corpsman with the 1st Infantry in 1969, was wounded, and twice cited for valor. His coverage of Congress has been rooted in a staggering work ethic and a belief that people need to know what goes on behind closed doors, what is in legislation, and how the sausage of governance is actually made. He is known for asking one more question, making one more phone call, and he is also known for getting it right. David Shribman, his colleague and now editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, who covered Congress with David Rogers, said of him, "He was the best reporter I have ever known." It is my honor to introduce this year's winner of the David Nyan Prize for Political Journalism, David Rogers.
When Alex first called in July, I was surprised, and I'm still surprised, but I'm also grateful, and I want to thank everyone responsible in the Nyan David's family for what's a very nice honor and a homecoming of sorts. Because it was here at the design school where I first met my wife, Rebecca, who fully shares in this award after putting up with me all this time. It was here Robert Manning published me, which was a huge break at the time. Here was the Globe, hired me 41 years ago, and soon after came David Nyan, as it worked out via Wilbur Mills and Fannie Fox. The center's given this prize before to a string of Pulitzer winners. People wrote big books, not to mention the famous Nat Hentoff. I'm none of that. But I'm certainly the first who not only worked alongside David Nyan, but also, as Marty said, under David Nyan. And those are two very different experiences, which David was surely laughing about tonight. I will always owe the Perth Amboy Evening News for giving me my start, but it was the Globe where I got my legs and the chance to do politics and eventually Congress. You have to understand I was still pretty fresh then from Vietnam. That was a violent and very isolating year. And I think more than people realize, there were huge gaps in my knowledge of what happened anywhere else in the world in 1969. The Globe sat me in the city room across from Bob Anglin, who became my teacher. Bob drank a bit at the same Venetian garden, put his cigarettes out on the Globe carpet, and thought he'd seen it all, until the new kid leaned over one day and said, "What's this thing called Chappaquiddick?" It's hard to do justice to the look of pain and agitation across Bob's face. He rose suddenly, pulled me to a corner, and whispered fiercely, "Don't ever let anyone at the Globe hear you say that again." Vietnam had left me, too, and Marty's hinted, with a bit of an authority problem. David Nyan did share this view. Soon after becoming my boss, he called me down from City Hall to announce my story's lead was dog shit. I always marveled that the conversation never went beyond that. It was just dog shit. There was a new sheriff in town, and I was on notice. Things got better, of course, and David and I survived the '79 elections. He supported my move next to Washington. Tip O'Neill signed off on me, and I think that was what was most important of all. But the real story was this, as Marty's already hinted, if I had an authority problem, so did David. Neither of us were managers. We were reporters, and that's what drew us together and what became a very nice, respectful relationship that ran long past our ties to the Globe. David used to say to me about the Globe, it's their bulldozer, but we get to drive it. The accent was on their and drive. It's no secret that the Globe had its own Irish-Yankee split then. On this subject, I'll never forget meeting Ben Bradley when the Post made a run at me to come over and cover Congress for them. It was near the time when Tom Winship was ending his famous run as the Globe's editor. Bradley wanted only to talk about who might replace his friend. The answer seemed obvious to me. I cheerfully predicted it would be the likes of Jack Driscoll or Marty Nolan. Bradley looked at me as if I were born yesterday. The Harps will never run that newspaper, he said. Harps? Hadn't heard that in a while. I was stunned. Yes, we will, I said, and I walked out. Of course, Bradley knew better than I at the time, but if anything, all this just reinforced David's second point, driving the bulldozer. And drive is what David did. He was the cobbler's friend, wearing out shoes covering impeachment in the 70s. A decade later, on assignment in London, my Wall Street Journal friend Jim Perry remembers Nine arriving from Boston to cover the British elections. The British hacks had never seen anything like Nine, Jim told me. He was so big and loud and funny, and he could drink any of them under the table. They followed him around awestruck like little acolytes. I was just along for the ride, Jim said, the big American's friend. Looking back now, I've worked for a lot of different bulldozers. A small city county paper in New Jersey, a big regional paper in the Globe, a bigger national paper in the Journal, and for these past 7 years, helping to establish Politico, which I will always owe a great deal for giving me a fresh chance after the Murdoch buyouts. I still don't tweet, but that's a fair cross-section of American newspapers. In that time, I've covered Congress for 35 years. You could argue that shows a certain lack of imagination. For me, Congress has always been the big river through which information flows if only you will take the time to pound the halls to hunt it. The people there can make you laugh or cry, but few places are better to learn about America, whether it is covert wars or food stamps, who has a lawyer or who doesn't in the immigration courts, what do the numbers in the appropriations bills really mean on the ground. In Vietnam, we called it riffing, recon and force. The choppers would drop you for short stints, pick you up, drop you again. It was a medic's nightmare because you had to travel light and choose what bandages to bring and what not. But more than you think, it has all stayed with me in Congress. Reporting for me is infantry. I'm ill now, but for years I walked miles every day in the Capitol looking for members, hunting clerks. As the sun went down, I even joked that the House and Senate seemed to come alive, not unlike the war. David, Nine, and I were different people, but reporting, wearing out shoes, trying to shed some light around the corner is what we both understood and shared. That's what he was about, that's what this night is about, and with these memories, I thank you again very much.
Theodore H. White was a newsboy who became a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and who changed both political journalism and politics when he wrote The Making of the President in 1960 about the Kennedy-Nixon campaign. For the first time, he raised the curtain on the warts and all side of presidential campaigns and changed campaign coverage forever. Ever since Teddy White, insider candor and behind-the-scenes drama have been a staple of campaign coverage. He followed that first book with 3 more, Making of the President books in 1964, 68, and 72. This year, the White Lecture is to be delivered by 2 of Teddy White's heirs as consummate political reporters, Mark Halperin and John Heilemann. It was very much in the Teddy White tradition that they wrote their 2 best-selling books on the last 2 presidential campaigns. First, Game Change, which told the story of Barack Obama's victory in 2008, and may be the only campaign book to be turned into a movie that went on to win 5 Emmys, 3 Golden Globes, and a Peabody Award. They then followed that up with Double Down, which was another riveting account, this time of the 2012 campaign. They are now co-managing editors of Bloomberg Politics, which leads Bloomberg's political and policy coverage, and which includes hosting a daily live television show they wryly named With All Due Respect. That title prompted John McCain, one of their first guests, to declare the title, quote, "the greatest contradiction I have ever heard in my life." John Heilemann has pointed out that the title isn't with all respect that is due. The program sets out to fuse popular culture, the political world, and TV, and has included such stunts as having Nancy Pelosi taste 4 kinds of chocolate ice cream. An early and anonymous critic of the show, identified only as a, quote, prominent Republican strategist, said of it, "I think I need to be consuming marijuana-laced comestibles in order to understand this concept." By the way, at 5 p.m. this afternoon, they did, With All Due Respect, here at the Kennedy School. And among other things on the show, they put up a video of Michelle Obama dancing with a turnip, the favorite video of their guest, who was the president of the Harvard Lampoon. The point is that they have been given permission to experiment with political coverage in a fraught and fast-changing environment, both in politics and in media. Both Halperin and Heilemann cut their teeth on more traditional political journalism. Before joining Bloomberg this year, Halperin had served as editor-at-large and senior political analyst for Time, covering politics, elections, and government for the magazine and for Time.com. He also created the page for Time.com, an online news and analysis tip sheet reporting on current political stories, campaign ads, TV clips, videos, and campaign reactions from every news source, along with his own analysis. Before that, he was at ABC News for nearly 20 years, where he covered 5 presidential elections, and he was a joint fellow at the Institute of Politics and at the Shorenstein Center in 2007. John Heilemann, who is a Kennedy School graduate, was national affairs editor for New York Magazine and NewYorkMag.com, where he wrote the Power Grid column in print and the Impolitic column online, where he treated politicians with his fabled all due respect. He was a staff writer for The New Yorker, Wired, and The Economist, and his first book, Pride Before the Fall, about Bill Gates and the Microsoft antitrust trial, was named by Businessweek as one of the best books of 2001. Game Change, Obama and the Clintons, McCain and Palin, and the Race of a Lifetime, that's the full title, became a New York Times #1 bestseller, and a team was born. They became regulars on Morning Joe, where they continue to pay all due respect, and where, when Bloomberg offered them the opportunity to do their work across all platforms with plentiful resources and a lot of room to try different things, how could they say no? Tonight you will hear from both of them. It is my pleasure to present for the first time the joint Theodore White lecturers, Mark Halperin and John Heilemann. Folks, just look this way. John Heilemann will speak first, and then Mark.
Got to get all my technology up and running here before I can get going. Alex, thank you for that gracious introduction. You read it just like we wrote it. We appreciate that. I happen to know Alex is a big fan of With All Due Respect. He told us that beforehand, and I don't think he was just pandering. And his mention of marijuana-laced comestibles makes me wonder, Alex, about your viewing habits, whether that's one of the reasons why you're such a fan of the show. But I won't draw any insinuations. Mark and I give a lot of speeches around the country. We talk to a lot of groups, and usually when we start, when I am allowed to speak first, I come up and I say that we're really thrilled to be in the place where we are, and it's a great honor to be addressing the crowd, and the crowd is obviously the most brilliant, distinguished, and good-looking set of people we've ever addressed. And then I say, I've never said that to any crowd before, and people laugh. This time, I actually mean it. We really are honored, incredibly honored to be here. This is because of the fact that we both are alumni of this institution, broadly speaking. Mark is an undergraduate at Harvard and me as a graduate student in this building. This is one of those things that I remember going to Teddy White lectures when I was a young man, and the idea that we would ever be, or that I would ever be in a position to give one was kind of unthinkable at that time. And so to be here today really is an incredible honor, and almost kind of breathtaking and hard to kind of get my head around to be up here. So thank you for the honor, and congratulations to David, who really is a role model for so many people in our business for all of the reasons that, that Alex laid out. I'm going to talk not for very long. One of the things that's problematic about doing a joint Teddy White lecture is that there are two of us, which means we've been placed under very significant time constraints. And I normally try to fill talks with a lot of long jokes and a lot of stories and stuff. I'm not going to be able to do that. I'm actually had to sacrifice all the gratuitous profanity from my speech, which is one of the trademarks that I like to bring to public speaking, so I'm a little disappointed about that. I'm going to talk not really about any of the things that you might expect I would talk about. I'm not going to talk about campaigns. I'm not going to talk about politics. I'm mostly going to talk about technology and our business. And Mark is going to talk about campaigns. The title of our speech was Optimism for a Change, Media Campaigns in 2016. I'm going to focus on the media piece of that and kind of fly up at 30,000 feet. For me, optimism is not a change. I have been unreasonably optimistic since I started my career in this business. I think mainly because I have been incredibly fortunate to work in some kind of extraordinary places. Alex ticked them off. I started out my professional career at The Economist magazine, and I worked for 3 other old-line magazines at New York Magazine, The New Yorker, and those 3 places, those 3 old-line magazines, all have met the challenges of the modern technological age in our business, which have proven really daunting for a lot of media operations. They've met them pretty well. And in most of the places that I worked, when I worked at those magazines, with the editors I worked and the publishers, they faced these great challenges that I'm about to talk about in a moment with a lot of fortitude and creativity. And being in those environments allowed me to stay kind of optimistic about the business. But the place I really want to talk about is not any of those 3, but is the time that I spent at Wired magazine, which really was, which gets to the kind of heart of the technological elements of where our business has been recently and where I think it's going in the future, and why there is in fact a cause for optimism. I was not that long out of this institution in the early part of 1993, only about 3 years out of this place when Wired magazine was first started. And I remember quite vividly being in an apartment in Paris. A friend of mine had been in the United States and brought back the first issue of the magazine, and I opened it up and read this letter from the editor and founder of the magazine, Louis Rossetto, which started by, it was an open letter to the kind of inaugural issue, and it started with the sentence that said, "Why Wired? Because the digital revolution is whipping through our lives like a Bengali typhoon." And then it went on to describe a magazine that was not going to be about technology, but about how technology would affect everything in our lives: the economy, business, finance, science, culture, entertainment, and politics. And it ended by saying that what this magazine is really about is, quote, "social changes so profound their only parallel is probably the discovery of fire." And it's possible that, like your Republican friend, it's possible that I was really, really stoned when I read that. But my first thought was, man, I want to work for that magazine. And a couple of years later, I was there. Many people think about Wired, which was at that moment in the early 1990s, the kind of avatar of change and of the future. Many people think of it as a product of the internet and a magazine that chronicled the internet and internet culture and rose out of the internet. It did many of those things, but it did not actually come out of the internet because there really was no World Wide Web when Wired started. In January of 1993, when the magazine started, the web had been invented, but was still an academic research project, and there was no commercial web. The commercial web was not inaugurated until December of 1994, when Netscape Navigator came out. 20 years ago next week was when the actual commercial web came into being. 6 months before that, Wired magazine, which did not have a website when it first started, because as I said, there was no web, launched a web operation called Hotwired. And Hotwired, 6 months before there was a commercial web, there was a website at Wired in San Francisco. That website over the course of its first year, did all of the following things. It ran the first ad that ever was on the World Wide Web. It invented banners as a form of advertising, which became the dominant ad form in the early web years. It was the first site to measure the effectiveness of online advertising. It was the first to attempt to do behavioral targeting on the web. It was the first to apply real-time web analytics. It invented the notion of a front door or a home page where there would be constantly changing updated news at the front rather than having something static, that everything would constantly be active and the thing would refresh itself automatically. It created the first, what I think of as the first real blog of the blog era, a blog called suck.com. Its name was indicative of its tone, and that tone of snarkiness and irony became pervasive in the web culture. Suck's motto was a fish, a barrel, and a smoking gun. I think you can see the connection to a lot of web culture in that. And then it started up a thing called the Netizen in 1996, which is where I went to work. It was the first thing on the internet, the first time that anybody on the World Wide Web had ever deigned to cover a presidential campaign with dedicated resources where people were not repurposing things that were in print and putting them online, but having actual reporters out on the trail writing native stories for the web. I was one of those people. So that's a lot of innovation. It's kind of amazing to think about it, that Louis Rossetto, the guy who wrote the Bengali Typhoon thing, before there was a commercial web, was not shrinking from the notion of technological change and the web, and was not resisting it, and was not denying it, but was instead embracing it. Lewis's motto, which is kind of almost stupid simple, and he put it on the cover of the magazine to mark its 5th anniversary. The motto was, "Change is good." Change is good. I think it's fair to say that for most of the mainstream media at that time, that their motto was not, "Change is good." Their motto was something more like, "Change is bad." And they greeted the web in exactly the opposite way that Lewis did. They shrunk from it. They tried to deny it. They tried to resist it. It is the case that change is not always good. Change is, in fact, kind of a complicated thing. Joseph Schumpeter, the famous Austrian economist who came up with the idea of creative destruction, equal emphasis on both those things, creation and destruction at the same time. And there's absolutely no doubt that in the beginning phases of the web, that there was a lot of destruction in the worlds of traditional journalism. We saw a lot of jobs were lost, and a lot of budgets were cut, and a lot of bureaus were closed, and a lot of ambitions were diminished. But I would say that the mainstream media in that period made the situation worse by trying to pretend like this was something that could somehow be avoided and would somehow go away. I remember quite vividly being in New York in 2001, right after the NASDAQ had crashed in 2001, and it looked like the entire tech sector and all the dot-com economy was falling apart, sitting with the editor of one of the biggest magazines in the country, who literally said to me at that time, "Thank God this is over. It's over now." And I said, "What do you mean it's over?" He said, "This whole internet thing, it's over now. We don't have to worry about it anymore." And I thought, man, you really are not with the program. And as we all know, it was not over, and it has continued at a relentless pace. Luckily for all of us, that was then and this is now, and we are in a very different world than we were 10 years ago, but there was a lost decade, I would say, in terms of mainstream media. Today in the news, there were 2 stories that tell you a little bit about where we are. There was one story, David Carr wrote a column about the New York Times cutting another 100 jobs through their buyouts or layoffs. That is the destructive part of the creative destruction that is still going on. At the same time, I read a story on Recode about there being a new round of funding that was being injected into Vox, $46.5 million, valuing that company, which includes sites such as The Verge on technology, SB Nation on sports, Curbed on food and fashion, and Vox itself on public policy and politics, valuing that company at $380 million. That is not an anomalous thing that's happening in our business right now. Just in the last few months, Business Insider, a web-only property, $12 million investment, $100 million valuation. BuzzFeed, a $50 million investment, $850 million valuation. It suggests something that was 10 years ago totally unthinkable, which is that hard-headed investors would not look at content and news as something to be steered clear of at all costs, but in fact as a reasonable business proposition, something that making investments in is attractive. One of the guys who was most responsible for this world we live in is a guy named Marc Andreessen, who was the guy who wrote the first web browser and then wrote the first commercial web browser. Marc Andreessen, now a hugely successful venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, and is a Super Bowl on the future of news. Wrote recently that he expected in the next 20 years for the size of the news industry to grow somewhere between 10x and 100x growth over the next 20 years. And the reasons were all very clear and very straightforward. Explosive growth in the addressable global market. The developing world coming online on the internet, the proliferation of cell phones means 5 billion news consumers worldwide by 2020. The end of monopolies based on distribution, turning the news business into an actual business and thinking about the business as if it were a business, which in Andreessen's view, and I would say mine, is a good thing. The news business is in fact a business, and it is also a public trust, but it is a business and must survive as such. And also the proliferation of new business models and content forms and distribution channels. All of those things, the business models, things like premium and freemium, conferences and events, crowdfunding, micropayments, philanthropy, all new sources for news, all being experimented with as we speak. The Andreessen argument is essentially that the news business will never host the big dinosaur, the giants that it once had before, but there really is space in this market for thousands and thousands of medium-sized, highly profitable news operations serving various distinct markets of an increasingly news-hungry global audience. There are no doubt some people in this room who will say that that is too optimistic, that a 10x to 100x growth over the next 20 years seems kind of crazy. And to that I would say, you may be right, but Marc Andreessen is a lot richer than you and me. And he got that way by making optimism a fundamental part of his investment strategy. He certainly downplays the pain that the business has gone through and still will have to go through as we go through this restructuring. But when I look around at the new ventures and new content forms when it comes to the coverage of politics and policy and public affairs, I see exciting, intriguing things everywhere I look. In addition to the aforementioned Vox and BuzzFeed doing ambitious reporting and analysis, and yes, it is true at BuzzFeed, even though there are you will notice mostly listicles and pictures of cats, there is in the background somewhere there a lot of serious journalism going on. You can also see Politico and Talking Points Memo and Vice, all covering politics and policy from divergent angles with seriousness and vigor. I see old-line newspapers like The Guardian and The New York Times finally seeming to have cracked the digital code and innovating like crazy on the web. I see Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post for $250 million and investing in it like crazy, and the paper being better than it has been in many years. I see ProPublica and our friend Evan Smith at the Texas Tribune inventing and then thriving on the basis of a nonprofit journalism model. And then there's what Mark and I are doing at Bloomberg Politics. Now, I make it a rule not to shill for endeavors that Mark and I are involved in. I will say, however, that Double Down is now available in paperback, and it makes a fantastic holiday gift. But I'll also say about Bloomberg Politics, and we'll talk about more about this in Q&A if you wish, we're doing a big, bold, ambitious thing, a multi-platform, digitally driven enterprise, politics vertical with deep resources devoted to TV, digital video, and text reporting with news, analysis, and long-form storytelling. Not all of these experiments that I've just listed will succeed. Some will fail. All may fail, although I certainly hope for our sakes that ours will not be one of them. But that is really kind of beside the point. The point really is that we are in a period now of protean experimentation. The period of the destructive part of creative destruction is a little bit more in the rearview mirror, and we are now into the phase where there is more creativity. Creativity is ascendant and destruction is on the wane, and that is good news for the news business. Before I close, I want to come back to Louis Rossetto's point. He said change is good. I'd say there's one caveat to that, which is that change is good, but that doesn't mean that it isn't hard. And that brings me to the words of another great philosopher, baseball Dodgers legendary former manager, Tommy Lasorda, who famously declared, quote, "Nobody said this fucking job would be all that fucking easy." And now, with great relief at having gotten in a little bit of gratuitous profanity, I want to thank you and hand over to Mark.
Thank you. I never met Teddy White, but I'm confident that we're here with us this evening. The first thing he would say is, seriously, another Bush versus Clinton? Really? As John said, it is an honor to be back here at Harvard and here in the forum at the invitation of the Shorenstein Center to give half of the Theodore H. White lecture. It's an honor, and for me, a little bit of a surprise. Frankly, one of my professors here at Harvard, in whose class I did not do particularly well, said to me at the end of the semester, and I'm quoting him now, "It will be a hot December day in Cambridge before you're ever honored by this university." And you know what? He turned out to be exactly right. I want to thank Alex and everyone at the Shorenstein Center I didn't meet Teddy White, but I did meet Walter Shorenstein a few times. And I can tell you what everybody who ever met him would tell you about him. He was a man of honor and intellect and compassion, and he wanted to make the world a better place, and he did through the center and through a lot of the other things he did. Just briefly about the Davids, the first presidential campaign I covered was in 1992 out in the field, and one of the most exciting things for me was spending time in New Hampshire with the Boston Globe reporters. And I know you all hear this all the time, but David, in a group of charismatic veteran reporters who understood politics and life, stood out, even amongst Curtis Wilkie and Mike Barnacle and everybody else. So really honored to be here as part of this evening. And David Rogers, when I worked at ABC News, I wrote a newsletter, and I referred to him as the 101st Senator. And the only people ever complained were people who pointed out that David had significantly more power and integrity than most of the others, most of the actual senators. I read every word he writes, and it's just an incredible honor for us to share the stage with him this evening. So David, congratulations. John talked about the media and the causes he has for optimism there as we head towards the 2016 cycle. I want to talk a little bit about campaigns themselves and how they work with the media. After that, we're going to take questions. As far as we're concerned, you can ask about whatever you want. Nothing's off limits. You could ask about the details of the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, or what John and I have learned covering the Clintons about their relationship for the last 25 years, whichever interests you more. All we'd ask during the Q&A is that you restrict all your questions to the form of true-false. So as you're thinking of questions, if you could think about it along those lines. I've covered a lot of presidential candidates. Back '88 really was the first one I covered as a researcher, and almost all of them lost. That includes Ross Perot, who's complained that his daughter's wedding was disrupted by some ninjas. Include Gary Bauer, who fell off a stage in New Hampshire while he was flipping pancakes. It included John Edwards, who talked about two Americas, while unbeknownst to the rest of us, there were at least two John Edwards. And it includes Michelle Bachmann, who at one point in the campaign trail mixed up the hometowns of the actor John Wayne and the serial killer John Wayne Gacy. Now, many of them, not all, but many of them, of the losing candidates elevated our political discourse, which is not easy to do. As you all know, there's a bit of a signal-to-noise problem in our presidential politics today. Politics has been pretty rough since the beginning of the Republic, but over the course of our careers, and I'm sure this is just a coincidence, things have gotten rougher. There's no doubt by almost every measure. There's false outrage, a lot of gotcha journalism, there's dog whistle politics. It's all part of the quadrennial vaudeville show that my friend John Harris and I a few years ago dubbed the Freak Show. So tonight I want to, in my time here, give you just a few suggestions that I've got for the bipartisan presidential class of 2016. Nothing I'll tell you is brand new. They're just best practices that over time have become less and less practiced. But I believe they're in the candidate's interest, the campaign's interest, the media's interest, and most importantly, in the national interest. First, I'd say to campaigns and candidates in 2016, forget the flip-flop fetish. I can't think of another so-called third rail of American politics that causes more damage by people trying to avoid it than it would cause benefit if people would just embrace it. Everywhere else in the world, when people change their mind, they have some thoughtful, self-aware views and opinions, they change, they evolve, they come to a different conclusion. They get new information, they make some new analysis. Sometimes they just have an honest change of heart. All those are completely legitimate reasons to switch your public position, even if it's 180 degrees from what you felt in the past or what you said in the past. The best candidates, the ones who are most human, the ones with the most potential to be successful presidents, will be unafraid to say when they change their mind. So that's my first piece of advice. Be honest about what you believe and why. And if you change your mind, be unafraid. Ignore the opposition researchers who will send out attacky screeds by email. Laugh off the press's obsession with any change in position. Slip on your flip-flops. Stand tall rather. Be true to your convictions and trust that the public will appreciate your honesty, because most of the time they will. That brings me to my second suggestion to the candidates. Don't worry if some people don't like everything that you say. Be who you are, say what you believe. Recognize that if you say something, anything, as opposed to bland, sanded down, nothing, some people won't like it, but others will. And don't sweat it when the media starts to trumpet headlines saying that the Democratic Club of Benton County, some state, is calling for you to apologize. John McCain, when he was a successful presidential candidate, organically behaved this way, of saying what he really thought, of being open, and it served him really well. And when he dropped that mode, for a variety of reasons, the impact was very dramatic and to his detriment. Of all the challenges that face Secretary Clinton, if she does decide to run, I think this is probably the biggest one. She and every other potential candidate need to embrace exposure, embrace the randomness of life and of the campaign trail and of humanity. Sincerity right now is the biggest trump card in our politics. And if you can come by it honestly, you can lap the field. Talk to voters in real town halls. Talk to people in the press. If something goes wrong, just deal with it. And remember, you don't need 100% of the vote to win. Third, reward news organizations that behave responsibly and punish those who don't. Now, some of you might be surprised to hear a reporter suggest that campaigns ever retaliate against news organizations, but it doesn't help anybody involved in this process to have unprofessional behavior continue without consequences. To be clear, I don't think any news organization should face retribution from a campaign simply for tough, fair coverage. But what I do think is that if a news organization engages in bad practices like willfully violating source agreements, or failing to ask a campaign for comment before publishing a story, or shows ideological bias, then a campaign should react with clarity and a decisive response. And news organizations should avoid reflexively defending their colleagues if they don't know the facts and if their colleagues have in fact failed to uphold professional standards. For the great bulk of journalists who behave ethically and responsibly, campaigns should reward them with real access, not create a cult of personality simply around the candidate, but give access to the candidate's family, friends, and most of all, the senior policy and political people around the candidate. Part of our problem of late is that we get to know no one around the potential president, and it's a corollary to saying what you believe and not worrying too much about who will disagree. Another way to create a direct connection between the American public and a potential White House and staff and cabinet is to give the country access through the press to the insight that people around the potential president's going to have. Fourth, remember that all beats are not created equal. Political reporters following a campaign every day are always going to frame policy announcements in terms of politics. They're going to focus on motives and positioning, things like that. So if you're going to make a major policy announcement, have a plan to reach out to the expert beat reporters and columnists and brief the heck out of them in advance of the policy speech. If you've got a serious proposal on deficit reduction, call David Rogers and walk him through it. If it's a serious proposal, you'll get a lot more credibility of having David Rogers write about it than a political reporter. If you've got a detailed national security plan, call somebody like David Ignatius and brief him on it. Again, if you've got a serious proposal, that's smarter than just letting it be covered as politics. Finally, the fastest and best way to end the freak show is to call it out when your own side shows up to perform. It's easy, if you're a Republican, to call out a Democratic freak show statement, and vice versa. Easy for a Democrat to do that on the Republican side. But it's a lot more meaningful and a lot more powerful if people call out their own side. Now, I'll give you an example, not to pick on Governor Romney, although I found doing that at Harvard usually gets a pretty good response for some reason. Don't laugh, he may be your next president. In 2012, Rush Limbaugh said some outrageous things about a Georgetown law student. And it was so outrageous that he lost some sponsors over it, and so outrageous that Rush Limbaugh actually apologized for what he said. Governor Romney asked repeatedly, refused to repudiate what Limbaugh said, even though I'm pretty confident that Governor Romney thought those comments were outrageous. In 2016, we should change that. When someone on the right says something completely outrageous about, say, Hillary Clinton, the leading Republican candidate should denounce it proactively and not grudgingly, not say something like, I wouldn't have phrased it quite that way, but really denounce it. And when that happens, people on the left, including the Democratic presidential candidate, should praise them for speaking out, and vice versa. Throw away the calculations about who will like it and who will not. Just say what you believe. Now, none of this is part of a magic potion that's going to cure everything, but all of it will help. And let's face it, freak shows had a pretty good uninterrupted run for decades now because the campaigns keep performing in it, the media keeps rebroadcasting it, and much of the public keeps applauding it. But if the major candidates and the campaigns take my suggestions on board, and the media gives them credit for it instead of criticism, we'll have a bunch of happier warrior candidates, a group of happier voters, and even some happier reporters. Now that would be positively freaky, but in a good way. Thank you.
John and Mark have agreed to respond to questions. There is a mic here, 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 and upstairs. If you would stand at the mic and please identify yourself, make your question short, and make sure it ends with a question mark, and we will proceed right with you, sir.
My name's Ben, and I'm a Harvard alumnus. In Australia, there's a much higher voter turnout because there's a requirement for folks to turn out to vote. In America, we're comfortable doing online banking. People are comfortable filing their taxes online. Yet the voting process seems to be rather antiquated. It's one day, and it's not always accessible for a variety of people. What are your thoughts on the potential of modernizing the voting process to make it more of a 21st century experience, and how would that affect political dynamics?
You or me?
You.
Sure.
Your turn.
Okay. I think that doing everything short of compulsory voting, again, this is my personal opinion, I think doing everything short of compulsory voting to make voting easier for people would be a good thing. I think the idea of doing, as long as we can maintain the integrity of the ballot, and there's obviously got to be as many steps as necessary taken to make sure that there's a lot of people obviously who are concerned about voter fraud, even though there have not been very many actual documented cases of voter fraud, but the notion that the ballot must have its integrity is obviously hugely important. The notion that we now do a lot of voting by mail in this last election and in the previous cycles, we're seeing a lot more of that. I think that's a positive advance. I'd like to see election day be a national holiday to make it easier for working people to be able to get to the polls. I think all those things would be for the good. I think we should try to, there should be an affirmative attempt to make it as easy as possible. I don't like the idea of trying to force anybody to do anything that they don't want to do, but I do like the idea of trying to make it as easy as possible. And I think there's been a lot of them, there are a lot of complexities around. I spent a fair amount of time with someone, a cryptographer once, going through the complexities involved in online voting and trying to do actual electronic voting. It's really, really tricky and really hard to do to maintain the integrity of the ballot in that context and make it untamperable. But I think probably at some point, and I don't mean in the near future, but in the long future, that is probably a piece of code that will get cracked and we'll end up doing that too.
I'm Brian, and my question is, you talked about trying to end the freak show and things that campaigns could do differently, and while those are laudable, isn't the lesson of the last several elections that the freak show works? Whether it was Bush-Dukakis, Obama-Romney, Bush-Gore, Bush-Kerry, isn't one of the big takeaways that very aggressive, personal attack-focused negative campaigns at the expense of issues is a winning formula for politicians?
Well, there's a difference between winning and being able to govern well. We've had three consecutive two-term presidents for only the second time in the history of the country. First 3 in a row were at the beginning of the Republic. And while all three got reelected, the first one was impeached, and the other 2 are routinely called the worst president of all time by their opponents. So I'd say 3 things about the premise of your question. One is the losers engaged in freak show politics in all those campaigns too. Now maybe they weren't as good at it, but they engaged in it too. So it doesn't mean just the winners do. Second is, again, I think there's things like the lack of faith in our institutions, including the government, to do the right thing, which has gone progressively down for a variety of reasons, not just the freak show, but that's contributed to it. I think it does make it harder to govern. And the last thing is, we're not going to do away with negative politics. It's just not going to happen. And again, we've always had that. I think the important thing is to restore a political center where you have people in the middle who are willing to work out compromise and willing to socialize with and talk about solutions to the country's challenges with people in the other party. And the more the national town square is dominated by extreme voices on the left and the right, the harder it is for a candidate to do that. You've seen these last three presidents all did a substantially better job of capturing the center than they did did their opponents. And I'd say, again, you could argue that the negativity that they ran on, because all 3 of them ran negative campaigns just like their opponents did, maybe have contributed to their inability to govern the way they wanted to. So it certainly helps you win, but it doesn't necessarily help you govern, and it certainly doesn't uplift our politics.
Hi there, my name is Natalie Brand. I'm a mid-career MPA here at the Kennedy School, and my background is television news. My question: in this era of experimentation, do you worry that there's a lack of quality control, and how do you get readers or viewers to reward the highest quality work that's being done, which doesn't seem to be happening right now?
Are you saying that based on having seen our show or not having seen our show?
Well, I think there's a challenge, I think, in all areas of journalism, not just broadcast journalism, that quality control is a factor. And I think, in thinking about one of the big advantages of the old system, which is to say a small number of established institutions, one of the advantages of that system was that because there was an ethic there, and there were best practices that had been developed over a period of time, you had a lot more internally enforced codes of quality control. In this Wild West world, which I view mostly optimistically, because I think that the market does in the end reward quality and punish falsehoods, and in fact falsehoods and bad practice, bad quality. And in fact, in a lot of ways, the increasingly social nature of our media allows the whole world to correct a lot of the mistakes that are routinely made both in good and bad faith by journalists in various institutions. I think experimentation, given if you look at just television, if you think about what currently passes for television news, in a lot of settings, there are obvious defects in both the broadcast television model and for a lot of people who just express discontent with the options that they have available to them on cable as well. So I think the bet, at least that we are trying to make, is that and we are blessed in a lot of ways with a proprietor and an institution that cares mostly about quality and mostly about doing things that are of high quality and different and differentiated from what other people do. But given the level of, we've participated in broadcast television, Mark for a lot longer than me, but in cable TV as well. And one of the things that we find as we go around the country and talk to people is a lot of frustration with what's on TV. So our kind of core bet is that by trying to do things that are smart, ethical, rigorous, but experimental and fun, that we'll be able to find some number of people out there. If we can do all those things together, we'll be able to find some number of people out there who have a high degree of frustration with what is currently on offer.
Good evening, my name is Nicolas Miai, and I'm also a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School, and my question is to John. I'm really glad you brought the technology and its importance in disrupting the media industry. And you've said that most of the destructive part is behind us, looking towards more creative part. And I'd like to challenge that. On the basis of the rise of artificial intelligence and the emergence of a set of algorithms that seem to be capable now, and more so in the future, to replace, to a certain extent, the role of journalists in assembling news. And I'd like to hear your perspective in terms of all these transformations which are coming could be, again, disrupting more and more and destroying some of the value.
First of all, that is not a true-false question, so it's more like a PhD dissertation, and also one that involves a concept like the singularity that I'm almost certainly too stupid to understand. It's a serious question, and I don't really want to be dismissive about it, because there are obviously huge advances that are going on in the realm of AI, and one of the great fathers of that work has been Ray Kurzweil, who was at MIT for a long time, someone whose work I've read. There is no doubt that we will, at one point in our world, that we will get to AI. And it seems to me, at least, on the basis, and again, I speak here as someone who is the most, the ultimate spectator in this area with no actual technological knowledge whatsoever. It seems to me that it has been a kind of a fleeting promise for a long time. And the people that I know who are the greatest believers in it tend to be people who put the timeline for it at a much more conservative time. They're very confident that it will happen, but they're not very confident that it will happen soon. when it does happen, that will create a new set of challenges, certainly for the news business and for a lot of other businesses. But hopefully I'll be dead by then, so I won't be worrying about it too much.
Sir, if I may just say two things in reply. One, thank you for your question, and two, thank you for directing it to John.
Hi, I'm Josh Dar. I'm a political science PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. Most of the success stories that you described are nationally framed news sources, Vox, Bloomberg, New York Times, like you said. What do you think might be the future of locally constructed political news in the online era, and what might be the political consequences if they fail to adapt?
Well, John mentioned one that I'd urge you to look at both as a business model and also for its journalism is our friend Evan Smith runs something called the Texas Tribune. Evan worked for Texas Monthly before, and Austin, like a lot of state capitals, Boston is something of an exception, had most of the bureaus closed or cut back by statewide news organizations, very little local television news coverage of local government. And Evan runs a nonprofit that raises money from various sizes of donations, has a huge press corps, and a largely digital product, including a lot of video, and an events business that does very well. And I think his model's pretty good. You know, you need owners who are willing to spend money. If you don't have a nonprofit model with contributors, you need owners who are willing to spend money for quality and hire reporters who care about news and content, know how to make it entertaining and accessible, but particularly now when if you're a local television station, you have to be in the text business, and if you're a local newspaper, you have to be in the video business if you're going to succeed. You have to be willing to invest in hardware. Part of why people at the Washington Post are so excited is they need the capital infusion, not just to hire good people, which they've done, but they need to be in the video business, and they need to be in the business of expanding their footprint beyond just a local and regional paper. So I think that the Texas Tribune model is good. There is a for-profit model, but again, to me, for whatever you're covering, whether you're national or local, you need to do the fundamentals. You need to invest in technology. You need to hire the best people. And you need to feel like you have a sense of mission to hold powerful interests accountable to the public interest and tell the stories of our time. Now, if you do that in the current environment, depending on what part of the country you're in, you might still not succeed because people your age and young people in general are less interested in news and getting it from traditional ways. I think that institutional brands matter a lot, but individual brands matter a ton as well. I don't care where David Rogers works. I will find his work because I know it's going to be high quality. And I think part of why local television continues to do decently well in a lot of places is because they're much more about branding individual brands because people are on camera than a lot of text places are. And I think, again, the Texas Tribune, you look there, they've branded their individual people through video, but also through their events in a way that's really important to people. People want to know who they're getting their news from now more than ever, and that's why it's got to be part of any business model.
I am Margot Howard. I'm a journalist and a townie. I have a simple question. In the movie business, writing partners are usually the way it works, but not in the news business. All I can think of is Evans and Novak. How did you two become a writing pair?
Slip Woodward and Bernstein into your answer.
Yeah, I was going to say. Yeah, Woodward and Bernstein. Did I slip that in good?
That's good.
Subtle. You know, we came together in a moment of kind of inspiration and happenstance. We'd known each other for a fair amount of time. In the 2008 presidential campaign, we started working on that. We decided to write the book very late. We had not planned to do it for a long time. We both were, like many journalists, covering that race and were sort of stunned by the extraordinary spectacle that was the Democratic nomination fight. And we were at it for many more months than we thought we would be. And relatively late in the spring, I believe in that about a 6-week period before the Pennsylvania primary, I was able to get away for a couple days of vacation, and I spent most of that time skiing and thinking how crazy it was that no one was making a movie about this, speaking of movies, was making a movie about this race, about Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. And I flew from the place I was skiing to Washington, where I met Mark, to go to a John McCain event in Annapolis, Maryland. He was doing his biography tour, was going around to places that meant a lot to him in his life, and we went to that event, and it was really one of the most epically bad political events we had ever been to. We had gone there expecting there to be 30,000 screaming midshipmen, all these McCainiacs, and when we got there, it was at the football stadium, and the entire stadium was empty. and the backdrop was the empty field behind him, and there were like 12 people shivering in the cold and in the seats, and the teleprompter ate one page of his script, and he didn't notice, and he went right through, and truly, given the quality of a lot of McCain's speeches at that point, not very many people noticed at all. It was just kind of random and weird and incoherent. He was angry, and we got in the car, and I said, this is what I'm talking about. Have you thought about maybe we should make a movie about this? It'll be like Fellini, given the way that event was, but we should make a movie. And Mark said, quite sensibly, as he often is very sensible, he said, have you ever written a screenplay? And I said, no. And he said, well, that pretty much means we're not doing that. And I said, okay, let's not do that. Let's do Ramana Clay. Let's do like a primary colors. Let's write a novel together. Let's do that. And he said, have you ever written any fiction? And I said, no, I haven't written any fiction. He said, okay, so next. And eventually we cycled to the thing naturally that we actually thought we could do, which was to do a nonfiction narrative account of the campaign. And really that entire conversation took place between Annapolis, Maryland, and ended on Capitol Hill, actually sitting in the shadow of the Capitol outside the C-SPAN studios. And by the end of about an hour conversation in the car, we thought, maybe there's something we could do here, that the campaign book has been kind of written off, but this campaign is pretty special, and we thought we had an idea for how to do it that would work, and we were off to the races.
Thank you.
One last question.
Sure. I've always enjoyed seeing you guys on Morning Joe. The question is this. You talk about moving to the center and the sense of optimism, which I would love to share as well. But the overwhelming sense in America, as you said, was frustration. And so we see all these institutions, whether it's a House and Senate caucus rules to fractionalize and ensure there's adherence, whether it's districting and redistricting, whether it's money and how we, through social media, compartmentalize and raise money through proactive or attacking fundraising. So it seems like institutionally we still are very much driving to a very fractionalized sense of politics. So how do we overcome that? Because I think, to me, that's the critical question.
I mean, all the challenges the country faces, and this one comes up around the country all the time, this one's the easiest to fix. This could be fixed tomorrow. We just have to create different incentives for the politicians. The politicians react to incentives. The incentives they have now drive them towards the extremes. You're more likely to lose in a primary than a general election in most districts and states. If you want to raise a lot of money or get a cable TV show or a radio show or a book deal, you got to cater to the extreme. If you cross over and try to compromise, you get punished by your caucus or your conference. So how do we change incentives? Well, voters can do it, donors can help, consumers of news can help, people in the news business can help. I think politicians have to lead to some extent, because some of them have to be brave enough to be willing to ignore the incentives and respond to different incentives. I think a candidate with good skills doesn't need to raise $100 million or $1.5 billion to run for president. I think there's enough ways to get your message out now that if you said, or Senate candidate said, you know what, I'm not going to spend 6 hours a day at the Senate Campaign Committee office making phone calls to raise money. I'm gonna run and win with less money than my opponent. I think that would be a liberating thing and could set a good example. If you voted for something or said something nice about the president of the other party, I think that could set a good example. It can happen. You know, I tell donors in particular that they've got more influence than anybody, because if the incentives to how to raise money went towards compromise and consensus and reconciliation rather than the freak show, you know, that'd be the quickest way to get the attention of the politicians. But we can do this as a country, and it's not just because it'd be nice to get along. We could get an energy bill and a deficit reduction and immigration and education. We get all those things done. If you took the politics and the personalities out of it, I think the President, Boehner, and McConnell could get that done in 20 minutes each. But you can't get the personalities out of it right now, and I don't think you can anytime soon. But you can get the politics out of it if people are willing to vote for things that involve compromise. In the current dynamic, and again, I wish I thought it was likely to change in this president's time in office. I don't. I hope it does. But in the current dynamic, most Republicans in Congress don't feel they can vote for anything the president's for, regardless of what's in his proposal, simply because he's for it. And if we're going to get anything done the next 2 years, Boehner and McConnell are going to have to go to the White House for a signing ceremony. And the president's going to have to give them a lot more of what they want than Harry Reid or Nancy Pelosi would like. Like I said, I think it's more likely to happen with a new president but I hope this president can find a way to do it. But it could happen tomorrow. It's not like, solving the effects of climate change. It's not even like dealing with immigration. It could happen tomorrow, but we all need to, as we have interaction with politicians, send them different signals about what the right incentives are, what the incentives actually are for them. And, if you're a liberal, hug a conservative and vice versa, because the politicians will respond to the different climate, not just about fundraising, but the media climate and the interest group climate. We all just have to help contribute to that.
I want to, again, congratulate Mark and John for being our superb Teddy White lecturers, David Rogers for our Nyan Prize winner. I want to remind you that all three of them, plus others, will be upstairs tomorrow, 8:30 with rolls and coffee, 9 o'clock to begin, to talk about some of the things that have been mentioned tonight. They will be joined by Jill Abramson, former executive editor of the New York Times, and Kristen Anderson, co-founder of Echelon Insights and a current IOP Fellow. That will, again, be 9 o'clock tomorrow, not over in Allison, but here, up in the penthouse. David Nyan Prize for Political Journalism in memory of our friend and former fellow. David Nyan was a man of many parts. He was an Irishman with an instant charisma and a killer smile. As a Shorenstein Fellow, he created a kind of glow. Tonight, we honor another aspect of David Nyan, that of consummate political reporter, which is the role that occupied much of his life and at which he could not be bested. David was a reporter and an editor and then a columnist at the Boston Globe, and his work had both a theme and a character. The theme was almost always power, political power, and also especially the abuse of political power by the big shots at the expense of the little guys. And yet he loved politicians. Well, let me amend that. I think the current political morass would have sent him into a frenzied rage, but that was also part of who he was. But he was always surprising his readers with his take on things, because most of all, David Nyan was his own man, and he called them as he saw them. In his memory and honor, the Nyan family and many friends and admirers of David Nyan have endowed the David Nyan Prize for Political Journalism to recognize the kind of gutsy, stylish, and relentless journalism that David Nyan embodied. David's wife, Olivia, is with us tonight, as are his children, Veronica, Kate, and Nick, his brother Chris, and sister Margot, and I would like to ask all the Nyans to please stand. David Rogers.
When Alex first called in July, I was surprised, and I'm still surprised, but also grateful, and I want to thank everyone responsible in the Nyan David's family for what's a very nice honor and a homecoming of sorts. Because it was here at the design school where I first met my wife, Rebecca, who fully shares in this award after putting up with me all this time. It was here Robert Manning published me, which was a huge break at the time. Here was the Globe, hired me 41 years ago, and soon after came David Nyan, as it worked out via Wilbur Mills and Fannie Fox. The center's given this prize before to a string of Pulitzer winners. People wrote big books, not to mention the famous Nat Hentoff. I'm none of that. But I'm certainly the first who not only worked alongside David Nyan, but also, as Marty said, under David Nyan. And those are two very different experiences, which David was surely laughing about tonight. I will always owe the Perth Amboy Evening News for giving me my start, but it was the Globe where I got my legs and the chance to do politics and eventually Congress. You have to understand, I was still pretty fresh then from Vietnam.
You don't understand. David Rogers has no respect for authority. Turned out this was typical Nyan mischief. Nyan just didn't want to lose Rogers. And when Marty called Nyan on his effort to try to kill the recruitment, Nyan flashed that killer smile and said, "Worth a try, right?" It's not hard to understand why David Nyan wanted to keep David Rogers. David Rogers is a reporter's reporter, and he has covered Congress for 30 years for the Globe, the Wall Street Journal, and now Politico. And he has done it with a kind of rugged personal integrity that has long been who he is. He was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War, but agreed to be drafted as a medic because, in his words, he couldn't get around the idea that if I didn't go, someone else down the street would have to. He served as a combat medical corpsman with the 1st Infantry in 1969, was wounded, and twice cited for valor. His coverage of Congress has been rooted in a staggering work ethic and a belief that people need to know what goes on behind closed doors, what is in legislation, and how the sausage of governance is actually made. He is known for asking one more question, making one more phone call, and he is also known for getting it right. David Shribman, his colleague and now editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, who covered Congress with David Rogers, said of him, "He was the best reporter I have ever known." It is my honor to introduce this year's winner of the David Nyan Prize for Political Journalism. Welcome to you all. I'm Alex Jones. I'm director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this very special evening for the Shorenstein Center. Each year, this night is really a highlight for the Shorenstein Center, which in 2014 is marking its 28th birthday. We're being live streamed on the web tonight, and for those of you on Twitter, the event hashtag, as you heard, is White14, and the Shorenstein Center's Twitter handle is @ShorensteinCTR. As some of you already know, the Shorenstein Center was founded in 1986 as a memorial to Joan Shorenstein Barone, a truly remarkable television journalist who died of breast cancer after a distinguished career. Her father, Walter Shorenstein, endowed the center as a place for a focused and searching examination of the intersection of the media, politics, and public policy. Walter was, above all else, a great citizen, and the Theodore White Lecture and the David Nyan Prize are to recognize that same kind of engaged activist citizenship, but from a journalistic perspective. A bit later, you will hear from our Theodore White lecturers for 2014, Mark Halperin and John Heilemann. But first, I have another task to perform, which is also an honor. In 2005, we established the This year's David Nyan Prize for Political Journalism is awarded to David Rogers, and therein lies a tale, because David Nyan and David Rogers worked together for a time at the Boston Globe. This tale of two Davids comes courtesy of Marty Nolan, another consummate political journalist who was there. This is the way Marty tells it. At the other end of Massachusetts Avenue on the Dorchester-Roxbury line is a bar and grill called the Venetian Garden. It's not really Italian, nor a garden, but for decades it was favored by workers at the electric utility company, the City Morgue, and the Boston Globe. One evening in the late 1970s, Marty and David Nyan were watering at the Venetian Garden. David was the Globe's new city editor, and Marty the Washington bureau chief. And Marty was thinking of recruiting a new correspondent for the Washington bureau. The person he had in mind was David Rogers, who worked for David Nyan covering City Hall. Marty said he was impressed with Rogers, who he found to be diligent, prolific, not afraid of work. No, countered Nyan. He's always pushing the envelope. Half the people in City Hall are mad at him. He just doesn't take no for an answer. And when Marty observed that this sounded exactly like the young David Nyan, Nyan responded in pained anguish,